Hello, my name is Simon Owens, and this is my daily vlog. Today, I want to talk about the podcast industry, and specifically, there was this article by Peter Kafka over at Recode Media, where he spoke to several venture capitalists, and they all talked about why they had no desire to get into the podcast game. They were not interested in investing any money in podcast companies, and a lot of they cited several reasons. A lot of them boiled down to was that the podcast industry is tiny. It's just peanuts. It's not worth their time in terms of like potential for payout. And then they cite kind of somewhat low listener numbers in the sense of it's still only like maybe 1 out of 4 adults in the U.S. who listen to podcasts. And then they also pointed to some research that shows that it's only really poised to grow about to about 200 million in ad revenue this year, which is a tiny drop in the bucket compared to a lot of other industries like digital advertising, which is upwards of tens of billions of dollars a year. Same thing with TV advertising or different kind of like online video and stuff like that. And they cite this as the reason why they're not going to even bother with podcasts. And this is just completely absurd. Like, whenever you read about venture capitalists, what they're always talking about is 10 times growth, 100 times growth, 1,000 times growth. In order for their funds to make money, every single thing that they have to invest in has to at least to have the potential to have 100 times growth, because they know most of the things that they invest in will fail. So they need that kind of level of growth or potential for growth to kind of level to make the other bad investments still profitable. And I mean, the podcast industry right now is poised more than any other industry to see that kind of growth, because it's still such a nascent, like, burgeoning industry that has nowhere to go but up. It's only producing $200 million a year, but just think about just the radio industry alone, and I don't think that's the only industry that podcasts have the potential to cannibalize, but just the radio industry alone is $17 billion. So that's like, if you think of podcasts as to a certain extent being somewhat of a kind of disruptor of the radio industry, and that it like some of the time that's being spent that would have normally been spent listening to the radio is now being spent on podcasts, especially in the car, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then I mean, that's tremendous growth opportunity. And then, another part is just that the opportunity to actual listen, the friction is going down. So it used to be that if you wanted to listen to a podcast, you had to have a very specific MP3 player, usually an iPod. And while millions of people had it, it wasn't nearly universal. But smartphones are almost completely 100% universal at this point. So everybody has a listening device. It's just that not everybody is actually utilizing it as a listening device. So it's just a matter of converting them to listeners. And there are several things that are removing that friction. One is that apps like Spotify, which already have tens of millions of users, we're seeing that they're paying for and getting exclusives and investing in podcasting. So that removes even more friction. They don't have to learn how to use a podcasting app. People are just able to start using an app that they're already listening for music. Another thing, is cars. Almost every single new car that you're buying has an iPhone jack, also has easy Bluetooth connections. And when you see a lot of analysis of the podcast industry, this is where they see a lot of growth. Now that it's a lot easier. It used to be when I listened to podcasts and back in circa 2006, 2007, I had to get a special tape deck type cassette tape adapter that plugged into my iPad and listened to that. So there was a pretty big barrier to listen to podcasts. And also, obviously, I didn't want to listen to headphones while I was driving, because then I could, I possibly wouldn't pick up on cues that would actually make it more dangerous for me to drive. But now that they easily connect to Bluetooth and people are already connecting them so they can make phone calls, it's just only one extra step for them to start listening to podcasts. I find myself, when I'm riding with others who know that I'm a podcast listener, them suggesting that I hook up to their Bluetooth center so we can listen to them. So there's a lot more opportunity, and that's a huge growth point. And then the other thing is, it's just like, we know podcasting is going to be great for advertising, because advertisers and podcasts production companies are reporting just amazing results of them. And one thing that when you talk to them, like why, it's because there's so much intimacy with podcasting that you don't really get with other mediums. It's not something that you usually listen to in broadcast form. Usually you're listening to it with headphones, and you hear people talk about how they almost feel like they know the podcast host because it's these people who are almost speaking directly to them. Podcast ads are often still, read by the host themselves. And a lot of times people are listening to podcasts while they're doing other things, so they're not actually like pulling out their phones to fast forward through. So they listen to podcasts. So that's why podcast advertising has been really effective. And I think more and more brands are going to continue to realize that. And that's why you're seeing, last year, the podcast industry, according to research, brought in $100 million in ad revenue. This year, it's $200 million. That's double year-over-year growth. It really doesn't have to double that many more times before it becomes a formidable industry. And lastly, advertising is just one component of it. Because of that personal connection, you're seeing more and more podcasts getting into the live shows space. So eating into what you consider as the live event space, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And you're also seeing things like monetizing through almost like a Netflix model or direct listener support model. So things got like Patreon, Slate Plus, which is from Slate. And I was just reading an article in DigiDay the other day how they're doing almost kind of like NPR-like pledge drives, and they're generating real revenue out of actual people subscribing for $5 a month. The aforementioned Spotify, Gimlet. Like I'm currently a member for Gimlet Media, and they're trying to kind of offer all kind of extra side benefits for theirs. And then Audible channels. So Audible app is incredibly popular. Obviously has lots of money behind it because it's owned by Amazon. And they are basically, they don't call them podcasts because they don't want to have that kind of connotation, but they're basically podcasts. So they've launched this product called Audible Channels, and you can only actually listen to them if you're either a Prime subscriber or specifically subscribe to Audible. And so there you have it. There's just tons of growth. If you're a venture capitalist and you don't see this as the potential for 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times growth, and that this is an industry that would be good to get in right now, then I don't know what you're thinking.